Hi folks, it is Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video. And for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. Today I'm very excited to be continuing my video series all about practical guitar and also music theory. Specifically, we're going to be learning how to play a bar chord today. And not only are we going to learn how to play a bar chord, but we're going to learn different applications of the bar chord, actually the principle of why a bar chord even works. And then I'm going to talk about the actual practice, what I do, and the techniques I've adopted to make playing bar chords easier. I'll also talk about a few less obvious practical ways to make playing bar chords easier. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about a few extra things. Bar chords are super crazy versatile, so I definitely recommend you stay tuned for this video if you're struggling with bar chords. And if you find this video informative and helpful, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to stay in the loop with what I do. And it, of course, motivates me to keep coming back to the channel, keep making videos. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. I have over 200 subscribers now, or maybe 200 exactly. I'm not sure, but it really does mean a lot. It's why I'm here right now. And I've got so much to say, so let's just get started. I have notes in front of me. I usually write notes for my students. I put them on the Google Drive. And so I'm sort of riffing off of those notes in sort of a Pages document in front of me. And so if I look this way, please don't mind me. I'm just trying to not waste anyone's time and stay focused. So I'll just give you the overview. I kind of alluded to it a moment ago, but the overview of this video is firstly, I'm going to talk about applications for the bar chord and essentially the incentive. Why do you want to learn a bar chord? Then I'm going to talk about what are bar chords in sort of at face value, but then why do they work in principle? Like what is the mechanism of the instrument that allows the bar chord to operate? Then I want to talk about my approach, my method of playing the bar chord, which I think if you learn that method, it should make it easier than if you were just trying to imitate, I don't know, what Jimi Hendrix or, Bob Dylan or someone was doing. Then I want to talk about a few approaches to making playing bar chords easier. And this can include anything from like intellectualizing the bar chord to also a physical practical technique that I'll be showing you. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about a few extra things that I couldn't fit into any of the other subjects. So if this sounds good to you, let's just go ahead and get started. So some of the applications for bar chords include sort of basically playing chords that are otherwise difficult to play open. So for example, if I asked a beginner guitarist, how do you play G sharp major? They might, using their theory and their experience with guitar, they might be able to work out an open way to play it. And that's more or less the open way of playing the G sharp major. That is a G sharp major and it's valid and it works. But the problem with this shape is that if you don't bar it and you try strumming through, I'm just gonna do it. It's not gonna sound pretty, but it sounds like this. Yeah. So here's a much easier way to play a bar chord or play the G sharp major. Really dead easy. You don't really gotta think about a whole lot. Another unusual example of using bar chords could be actually to play chords that you think should be easy. So for some reason, people tend to think of sharps or flats as being harder to play for some reason. But for example, the B major chord, when you think about the cage system, which is the area of the subseries we're in right now, looking at how to play C, A, G, E, and D, you might have noticed we don't learn how to play the F major chord or the B major chord, even though it sounds just like, because they're naturals, you'd think, oh, we're going to learn F major, we're going to learn B major. The reason why is because the easiest way to play an F major chord is to play an E major. We play an E major chord and then we bar it on the first fret, right? E, F. And that is our chromatic scale at work there, of course. And then here, for instance, we have the A major chord, and the easiest way to play B major, the reason we don't learn how to play B as an open chord, even though there is a way to do it, the reason we don't learn it is because actually the easiest way to play a B major chord is to play an A major chord. A sharp, B. Ta-da! So this is the idea of being able to play more chords, basically, but what I just did totally alludes to the cage system entirely, right? The advantage of playing the cage system is that you can play a chord like this, and you can know that it's a major chord because you use the E major shape, but that you don't actually know which chord it is or what its components are, just because you use that shape. You can move around, and all of those are major chords, and if you know your chromatic scale, you can easily find the root. For instance, this is a B, this is a C, C sharp, so you follow the chromatic scale, So you know the name of the chord and you know that it's major, but you don't have to say, I know the names of each and every note within that chord. You'll know the intervals, and that's a different thing. And that's where the value is. It's in the intervals, in the relative intervals being moved together. And there is an additional advantage to knowing how to play a bar chord, which is basically when we finally talk about functional harmony and chord progressions, which I'm super excited about because it's the foundation of songwriting actually, we will learn cadences, or what are called chord progressions. So for example, here is the 1-4-5-4. Now the 1-4-5-4 cadence or chord progression, right, in E might work fine for you, but if you can't sing in the key of E, you might say, I need to transpose it. Bar chords are incredibly handy for that, and I'll just show you, but I'll probably do another video entirely all about it. You know this physical chord shape, right? E, A, B, A, right? So this is the 1-4-5-4. Let's say that you could sing in G sharp major. So let's go ahead and just move it. So we take our E and we create a bar to play the G sharp major, and we repeat that process. That is also the 1-4-5-4, but now it's just in G sharp major, not in E major. So it means that chord transposing key signatures is also super easy. Now let's just talk about what are bar chords at face value and why do they work. So at face value, when you look at a bar chord, if you were like me and you saw like Jimi Hendrix do it or something, then you probably would have just seen them take their index finger and place it perpendicularly across the fretboard. And that is the mechanism of playing bar chords, and that's where all the glory lies in all this theory that I'm talking about. This cage system and moving stuff around is all facilitated through the practical technique, the physical technique of the bar chord. And it basically just requires taking your index finger or finger one, placing it perpendicular to the fretboard in a way where you adjust the pitch of every string equally. And that's important, and I'll come back to that later. So now let's just talk about why do they actually work. Well, this idea goes straight back to the idea of guitar anatomy, actually. So it's something to do with the shape and the design of this instrument, which is just so clever. And when it struck me, I was just like, oh yeah, whoever like really, the finessing of this instrument took years. I mean, it was hundreds of years of developing it so it was the way it was. And it's just so brilliant because now it's actually a really refined thing. It's really smart. So it goes back to that first video I ever made, which was about guitar anatomy, which I hope you'd seen, but if not, I'll sort of recap about it now. Here you'll see in guitar anatomy, we have what is called our headstock. We have our tuning pegs, which the strings are attached to right here. And we have our neck, and we have our fretboard. That's sort of the darker wood here. These are the fret inlays. And the point at which the strings are making contact with the instrument is actually here on the nut. And the nut is the rationale for our bar chord. And the reason being that when you think about what's happening and what the purpose of the nut is, when you strum, all the vibrations that are possible on this instrument are bracketed between what is the nut, this area here, and the area down here, which is the saddle, which is also this kind of block-like thing. And anything that happens between is an audible thing. And when we fret, or when we produce a bar chord, what we are essentially doing is we are relocating the position of the nut. We are actually basically, in practice and in theory, we are basically saying the nut isn't here. The nut is actually here. And this is our fretting position, right? And that this is actually where the nut begins. And then in that sense, you can imagine almost the headstock is here, not actually up here at all. And this is because just like when we strum before the bar chord, it's barely audible, right? Imagine this. Here's a bar chord, or here's a bar. And anything, again, that happens here is also very inaudible. So it serves that same purpose. Now let's talk about the practice of actually playing a bar chord. And so this, when I first saw the bar chord, you know, the Jimi Hendrix example that I keep giving, when I first saw that, visually, it was just, he took his index finger, he kind of just did that. And I sort of just hope for the best. And that is the commonality here. So we've got to learn the actual practice. And from the player perspective, and from my perspective over years, I've sort of finessed this specific movement, this nuanced technique, and I've adopted certain things that I feel work better, and I'll explain those things to you now, and I'll try to do it in a way that is cohesive and you can follow along with if you can. So what we're first going to do is, just like it looks like, we're going to take our index finger and we're going to place it on the fret that we need to play the bar chord on. So in this case, we're going to play on 4, or you can do whatever one you want. But I'm going to do 4 because I want to play G sharp major. Yep. And we're going to take this index finger, and the first thing we need to do is we got to match the placement of our index finger with an equal opposite force to help stabilize it. And that's going to be our thumb. Our thumb is going to be in the middle of the back of the neck, and it's going to serve as that pinching mechanism. And that is actually the playing of the bar chord, a pinch, right? And if your thumb is too high or too low, you can run into issues. And actually at the end of this little section, I will be talking about troubleshooting that relates to that and other stuff. So now that we've created our equal opposite force and we have our flat bar, what we're going to do is we're just going to take a minute and we're going to acknowledge the inherent anatomy of our hand and our fingers specifically. So when I did that video about correct fretting, you might have noticed that I talked about not fretting on the tips of our fingers, not fretting on the face of our fingers, and I even drew a face, right? But instead to fret on the tips of our fingers. And if you look at my fingers now, all of the calluses I have, all the fret lines, right, all the lines that I have in my fingers, they're all here at the tops of my fingers, never here. And the reason is, if you just take your picking hand, or, you know, if you're right-handed, you'll take your right hand. If you just feel this area really quick of this finger, the face, I'll just call this the face of our fingers, because when we face it, it faces us, I guess. If you feel that area, you'll notice 2 things about it, hopefully. Firstly, it is squishy. It is a squishy area. You can push in, and it's squishy and kind of moldable. And then the second thing is that if you kind of go lightly, you'll notice it's sensitive. And these 2 things are very important. And our fingers and the faces of our fingers being squishy is great for picking up kind of weirdly shaped objects so that our fingers can form around them. And then also the fact that our fingers are sensitive is very helpful, of course, for making sure that we're not, I don't know, picking up broken glass and cutting ourselves and not realizing. Okay? Now, I want you to take your right hand and feel the joints. Feel what happens when you get to the joint area, and specifically the sides, not the face, but the sides, right? And hopefully this is in focus, yeah? And what happens when you feel that? You might notice it's bonier, it's a little bit kind of denser, the skin is thinner, and if you like flick it almost, it kind of doesn't hurt. It's not that sensitive. And that's because our joints don't really, they can't do the things that the faces and the pads of our fingers do. They can't kind of touch stuff and mold around things. They serve the purpose of kind of bending the entire finger around a thing, so you can pick up a can of Coke or a bottle of Frank's hot sauce, you know, so you can wrap your fingers around a thing and pick it up. And that's the operation. But because of that, it's not especially sensitive. It's not especially squishy. We're going to use this anatomy to our advantage. And I know I spent some time explaining that, but it's so vital to being able to precisely exact this technique. So what we're going to do is, with our thumb and our index finger in equal opposite sort of forces in the squeezing motion, before we start squeezing, we're just going to rotate our hand, our fretting hand, slightly outwards or counterclockwise, so that the knuckles are now on the strings. And specifically, we're going to start thinking about this y-axis. So this is kind of the x-axis, the string direction. This is the pitch axis. And by that I mean, as we go up the neck, we increase in pitch. And as we go down the neck, we decrease in pitch. What we're going to do is, the y-axis is how high or sort of low in contradiction with that movement we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to align our knuckles, each of our knuckles, and I'm going to call this knuckle A, right? Knuckle A and knuckle B. And we're going to try to align those knuckles with the strings. And specifically the highest, the lowest, so our knuckle A is going to go with the low E and A strings. And knuckle B, this bigger knuckle, is going to go with the B and D. And so it's kind of easy to remember. B, bigger knuckle, goes with B and D. And A goes with E and A. And we're going to emphasize the knuckle placement around these general areas, the lower 2 strings and the higher 2 strings. And this is going to serve to our advantage. And we want to also, now that we've constructed this sort of shape and this kind of clamping thing, you hopefully should notice that it's easier to apply the direct pressure required to push the string down. And then if you rotate again back to that first position and you just try squeezing like this with the face of your finger and this kind of soft, sensitive, squishy part, if you try squeezing with that now, notice how much more difficult it is, and notice how much easier it is with that knuckle part. Now this is that technique I'm talking about. Now we need to follow the rules of correct fretting, basic correct fretting, which is we want to make sure that when we fret, we are close to that metal fret bar. We want to be close to it. We don't want to be on top of it. We don't want to be too far from it. We want to be in that sweet spot somewhere in between. And you want to look out for that. And now I want to talk about troubleshooting. So troubleshooting, you might run into some issues. And this is true with correct fretting, but also with the bar chord. You might run into buzzes or mutes. Now the rule of thumb and kind of the golden rule, the thing I would ask any of my students to look out for is when you hear a buzz or a mute, and you hear that sound, the first thing you want to do is locate where the sound, which string the sound is coming from. Usually you can feel it when you pick or strum, but if you just kind of feel, you can sometimes even feel it with your fretting finger. Then you want to look at that string, but specifically the point at which the finger, your finger 1, is making contact with the string. Your index finger will be making contact, and that is what is the source, the origin of that buzz or mute or whatever. Then using the guidelines I just sort of expressed, being close to the fret bar, making sure you're using, taking advantage of the knuckle area. You want to keep those in mind, and you want to see if you can just tweak it ever so slightly. One of the problems with bar chords is they're physically demanding. And so the harder you try to do them, if you're struggling to get that clear sound out, it can start to drive you a bit nuts, and you start overdoing it. And the thing is, the more you do it, the harder it becomes. And then the harder it becomes, the harder it is to do it right. So if you just take a moment to reflect, take a deep breath, reflect on what you're doing, you can make a slight tweak, get that clear sound out real easy. Okay, now some other troubleshooting to look out for. If your thumb, like I was saying before, is too high or too low on the back of the neck, you could actually bend the string. And you don't want to do that. It will also, of course, be harder, but the bending is another thing that you want to watch out for. And I think that just about does it for some troubleshooting. If you find that you run into other issues or you have solutions for resolving the bar chord, write something in the comments below. Now let's just talk about other things to make this easier. Because like I said, and I said before, and I'll say it again, playing bar chords can be physically demanding. It can be difficult. If you follow the guidelines I've just set up beforehand, right? If you follow those guidelines and the knuckle thing and the whole thing I just stressed tons, it should already be a lot easier than if you just went in without any knowledge of that and just tried using the face of your finger and it was soft and difficult and it drove you nuts. If you follow those guidelines, it should be easier. But here are 3 things that are totally varying ways of making playing the bar chord easier. The first thing you can do that will make it easier, and the easiest thing you can do to make it easier, is consider your instrument choice, right? So if you're playing on a classical guitar, I would say, like I'm doing today, it is probably the middle option. It's not the hardest, but it's not the easiest. The reason that it's sort of the middle option is because although the strings are made of nylon, so they're soft to push down, which is great, that's really helpful, 2 issues can emerge. One, that the action is quite high. And when I say action, specifically the string height, the height of the strings and how far it is from the fretboard is actually higher on this instrument than probably either of the other 2 types of guitars. And so the higher the string, the more factors, the more variables there are that you'll wiggle the string around and end up with a bend of some kind. So classical guitar could be more difficult for that. Also, the neck width is a wider width. It's instead of being 48 millimeters, 52, which means if you have smaller hands, you might have a hard time actually reaching in a way where knuckle A can land on the E and A strings. You might find that that's just difficult on its own. Now the hardest option, and I'll try to wrap it up quick because who wants to know the hardest option, is acoustic guitar. And this is because the strings are metal and also because they're thicker than either a classical or an electric guitar. And the fact that they're metal and the fact that they're thicker means that they dig into your fingers and you'll notice it more than on the other instruments. But electric guitar is the easiest option. And if you have the luxury of a choice or you're still deciding on the instrument, electric guitar for sure is easier, and it's for these 3 reasons. Firstly, that the strings are thinner. Secondly, the width of the guitar neck is actually thinner too. So it's like an acoustic guitar, but because the metal strings are thinner, it doesn't feel like an acoustic. Also, the action is lower than even on an acoustic. So usually the amount of force you need to push down is less than the others. So I would recommend the practical solution to making it easier, just to get you in the game, start getting the results you're looking for. Try an electric guitar to start. But if you don't have that at your disposal, or if you do and you're still struggling, I would say that the next sort of tip that can make the whole playing of a bar chord easier is consider engaging your whole body and all the muscles sort of that are at your disposal. So this has to do with correct posture, and I'm just going to have to sort of demonstrate this, and I'll talk it through as I do. But basically, when you have correct posture, you want to make sure that the body of the instrument is making contact with the side of your torso slightly. And this is so that way you have a good grip on it and you're sort of connected to it, and you can kind of dance around like the Beatles might have or something while you play. And that connectedness to the instrument I find is very valuable too, because you can feel the vibration of the instrument as you play too. So I feel like that's pretty handy as well. Now, what you're going to do is with your right arm, if you're right-handed, you're going to rest that by the sound hole as you normally would, trying to find a nice comfortable spot where it doesn't really move to reduce variables. And you're going to apply a little pressure so as to rotate the neck and the body of the instrument clockwise away from you like this. And when you do that, now you're going to take your right hand, your left hand, which is your fretting hand, and you're going to pull the neck of the instrument back in. You're not going to squeeze with your thumb. You are going to place your thumb there, but you're just going to squeeze and pull it back in so as to kind of get it back into position as though it was almost getting away from you. You say, no, pull it back in. And with that muscle, you might have noticed the engagement of your shoulder muscle probably first. And that's sort of where I would go for, kind of your lower, kind of, I don't know, deltoids or something. But this kind of area, the back, your back muscles, you want to engage the back muscles, maybe a bit of your shoulder here, and then maybe a bit of your bicep too, just kind of pulling it in, almost like you're doing a curl. And when you engage these muscles, what you're doing is you're supplementing the intricate muscles of your fingers and your hands. And that way you don't have to depend so much on the squeezing motion of the bar chord, but you can kind of do the pulling motion and treating your index finger, your finger one, as kind of just like a flat bar that's kind of inanimate. You kind of pull against it and you let the shape of the bar produce that sound. And then the purpose then of your thumb and the hand muscles is to do the nuance, to get that exact sound out, right? That clear sound out, and to do the nuanced maneuver. And then the third kind of advice I can give about playing bar chords easier is to strategize, to use your intellect, use your mind, try to make it easier given what you know. So if you know that you're going to be playing an arpeggio and you only need to play the root of a bar chord, if you know that this is what you're going to be doing, you might even notice I've crooked my bar finger, that index finger, I've crooked it in such a way where I'm not even doing a bar at all. I'm just playing the chord like this. And that's because I might not need to play those top two strings. And it's important you're careful, of course, not to play them. For instance, here, there's a musical, not contradiction, but it's going to sound pretty crunch if you play those open strings. So keep that in mind. But the idea here is to do what you must, not to squeeze every string with absolute brute force to the point where you get that really super clear sound out, because overdoing it's not going to help anybody. And of course, when you fret, whatever happens behind these fingers that are fretted, again, doesn't play a role. It won't be a factor in the sound you get out in the end. I can do anything behind these strings that I want, and it won't affect the sound. Examples of this or variations of this could be when you actually need to play the bar chord, but with a partial bar, like this. And when I do the video about the A major and A minor chords, I'll actually be reviewing this technique a little more, which is the partial bar. So you don't bar the entire length, the entire width of the fretboard, just the strings that you need to get the sound out from. And this is handy with F especially, because as you get closer to the nut, it's actually harder, it gets physically harder to produce the bar chord sound. It is harder just because the tension between here and the first fret is more than it is sort of between here and kind of, I don't know, the 7th fret. And so you want to strategize and apply pressure where it's most needed. Even if you have to do a full bar, one thing you can do is kind of deliberately crook your finger slightly. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. But by crooking your finger ever so slightly, and when I say finger, index finger I mean, you can do it in such a way where you can kind of get rid of the pressure of those middle strings, the A, D, and G strings. because you're already fretting them again. So it doesn't really matter what happens behind there. So if you're doing kind of like an unprofessional sounding bar here, it won't make a difference. Okay, great. Now let's just talk about a few extra things and then we can wrap this video up. Some extra things. When you're playing the A-shaped bar chord, so today we focus on the E shape because it looks like an E major, right? But when you're playing the A major, you've got to consider the possibility you might need to adjust your index finger, finger one, ever so slightly, so as to play now that A string as your new root. And with that in mind, you can ease up on the lower E, that E string, because it is not the root, and while it's usually permissible in the sound, that it's not the focus. And if you go back to even the A major chord, you're not trying to play the low E. If you happen to play it, it's not a problem, but to get that really clear sound out, you kind of want to just start from the string A. So keep that in mind. Then I want to talk about actually how we can talk about bar chords, right? Because the advantage of bar chords is that this is major and this is major. But how do we actually talk about a bar chord without knowing all the theory behind what chord this is? The first thing I'll say is that you want to be able to figure out the root. And to know the root requires a good understanding of the chromatic scale, but also a good understanding of the footnotes, the side, these kind of stickers, or, you know, they might be inlays on your guitar. The fifth sticker, or the fifth kind of dot or whatever that you have on the neck, that will tell you where A is, because the 5th fret on the E string is A. And then the 7th will be B, and then the 9th will be a C sharp. If you remember that, if you can keep that in mind and practice it and say it out loud, you'll know that the 6th fret, for instance, is an A sharp or a B flat. And you want to be able to keep that in mind when you go through this process. But besides that, how can we navigate this in a way where we can talk about it? So the way I like to talk about it, and I've done it a few times in this video, is saying the origin open major chord or minor chord that I'm referring to. So in this case, this is an E major shape. This is because when I play it open, it's E major. But when I play it as a bar on the 6th fret, it's still the E major shape, but then I say I'm playing the E major shape on barred on the 6th fret. That's how I talk about it. I play the A major shape and the A major shape barred on the 4th fret, the 5th fret, the 6th fret, or the A minor shape barred on the 3rd fret. This is how I communicate it, and I find that this works fairly well when I'm talking to other people or if I have to think about it even myself. And then finally, I just want to talk about this concept of moving chords. So we talked about this major and the minor, but the beauty, and just it's kind of an advertisement for the cage system in general, but the beauty of the cage system is that we are not limited to major and minor. We can extend it, not just major and minor, but we have major, minor, we have dominant, we have major 7th. We can move all those variations around. The E major 7th to the G major 7th, or the A major 7th. And it works with all these variations of the origin major, open major chords, like A major 7, C major 7, D major 7, you know, E major 7. All right, so that just about covers everything I want to talk about in this video. I know it was longer. I hope you found it helpful. If you are struggling with bar chords, hopefully this made it easier and you got some techniques you can employ to make things work more for you. Let me know if this video was helpful in the comments below. Let me know if you think that there's a tip I overlooked that you found helpful for yourself. If you did find this informative and helpful, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the absolute best way to stay in the loop, and it will motivate me to keep coming back to the channel and making content. It really does. And just to see that I have 200 subscribers, it does mean a lot. So thank you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one. Ciao for now.